Alright, hello all, and I think for this video I wanted to actually go back a little bit and do a little bit of theory posting, I suppose, as I like to call it. But I really wanted to talk about sense. And here lately on the channel, I've been working on this Hobbes video that I want to do. And so I looked at Leviathan, of course, and obviously he starts, everything off with the senses. And so obviously, if, you're going to talk about Hobbes and then Descartes and sort of this era, they're trying to navigate, methods out of the medievals in this sort of, I guess, most agreed upon way that they can, possibly get to, this sort of objective way of looking at the world, or trying to place it in a sort of empirical or in the continental kind of rational way, I suppose. But then, this really just, of course, has me thinking of today and right now and, current events. And I saw something that was kind of interesting that I've noticed and talked about a bit on this channel, and that is, of course, the digital experience, the sort of online presence, and the internet's use of language and metaphors, this sort of digital presence that people in the postmodern era, even before the internet was coming, like with, Baudrillard, for example, in like the simulation, they were talking somewhat, foreshadowing this sort of hyper-real experience that we are all in now. And I think, when we look at this sort of, philosophy that I've been doing on the channel, looking at these classics, I guess you could consider it somewhat of a black pill, but our sense perception and a lot of implications that come from our way of going about knowledge, and with Hobbes, for example, even an ethic built out of that, right? If we can't, if we live in this sort of hyper real, sort of simulated and stretched, sort of synthetic presence, where we talk about this science is constantly being discussed in discourse right now, and you get the kind of discourse going on, or constantly about whose interpretation of the sciences, and you live in this sort of digital sphere, these algorithms that ultimately are, of course, controlled by big tech and whatnot, and censorship. That's a whole different thing that we could talk about. But nonetheless, you have this sort of synthetic tapping into these extreme polarities of senses, of someone else's senses. Viral videos, we're not even talking about just political orientated events. We could talk about the sort of soccer mom seeing a dog reunite with this cliched like family or something like that, and you get this sort of feeling of this sort of presence. You're not, of course, there. You don't even know these people, but it taps into your sort of faculties of senses, to the point where you have this sort of there's literally cases, right, where we have especially women in particular, they'll just constantly get themselves worked up in this sort of digital social sphere, where they're constantly having this sort of digital sense experience, stretched to its maximum of constantly tapping into these particular events. And obviously with that comes this sort of paranoia and, too hot for YouTube these days to say anything now. When it comes to data composition and interpretations of said data, this is ultimately, the narrative crafting that human beings, like to do. And, we could talk about the kind of obsessive psychology that we find ourselves in, and all these different disorders and ailments of the mind itself. And I think this is rooted in this sort of digital presence, but it's not just this sort of simulation of us being caught in of, we should just pay attention more to the physical material world, if you will, around us, but everything is actually being privileged over time in this sort of digital atmosphere over our physical presence. This is not an endorsement, of course, by the way. I think there's a profound problem with this. And I think if we were to actually come to a sort of logical conclusion out of what that really means in sort of society and the kind of attitudes that came with it, in prior, times within the West, right? With like Francis Bacon. This is something my next video after this will be about, where, Francis Bacon talks about societies and, trying to use knowledge of natural processes to, better the kind of divine kingdom, heaven on earth, as it were. And, his kind of statement on knowledge is power. But, what is knowledge in this sort of oncoming, digital experience where this is kind of, even replacing the physical sort of reality itself. We're literally choosing to do this in a lot of different ways, culturally, I think, and socially. I've talked about this before on the channel, right? We're seeing, the rise of online relationships to the point where I would argue a lot of, especially in the younger demographic, the late millennials, even later than me, and Gen Z, of course, and the subsequent even generation, starting to bud even behind them. It's worth really questioning whether or not the sort of relationships and pursuits that they will have won't come from the digital presence first. And I guess if we were going to, come down from the ivory tower, I suppose, of abstraction here, I think there's a lot of examples that I've talked about before as well when it comes to, the idea of the catfish. This was especially popular among my demographic and the millennial. Don't get catfished. It's usually this sort of, extreme example, perhaps, of, someone exploiting, digital presence for something that they're not. But this happens all the time, all around us. We see all the times that, people's temperaments and sort of presence in, the real world has a totally different temperament than what we would actually observe them in their kind of social accounts. And this doesn't necessarily just mean frog posters who are just, being anonymous and they're really shy and this is actual, people who are not so afraid to put out their thoughts on social media and ultimately would never say that to you in real life. I think that this actually has a lot more profound impact than people are realizing right now, because ultimately I actually have concluded that we're on the cusp of that person's actual digital experience, that person's way we sense that person, and their kind of, personality actually is more inclined to believe in their digital simulated persona as opposed to the physical one. And I've obviously advocated to my viewers and people that, in 2021, whether you endorse this or not, using the internet, using technology to your betterment is the most feasible way. It's obviously, you can't just have people deciding to run off and kind of, I guess, live this sort of rural return to cave kind of attitude. But because all it takes is just one person tapping into a sort of innovative techniques that's more efficient, and the whole thing will just fall apart. One person gets on Twitter, one time, and it's over. It's just not going to happen. And so trying to harness this and use this responsibly, and ultimately understanding as well that there is a sort of digital presence almost for everything, or there is a sort of a metaphor that's reached beyond just this sort of way we're experiencing reality, and this sort of simulation, if you will, these sort of simulated symbols that was talked about among thinkers, does leave the door open to new ways of really going about the world with this sort of digital presence. And I guess what I mean by that is you can actually have a new relationship with things of the past, of the old, through this sort of digital experience. Now people would argue that this isn't authentic, but I don't think there is anything more authentic than trying to express this sort of intentionality of self awareness, really, but more than that, just the sort of intention of making do with the most in your time. And I think this is the only real path forward that actually sort of makes sense, that isn't necessarily so pie in the sky. The kind of, well, put it like this, I think that this sort of institutions, whether they're corrupt or not, the institutions that made society, eligible and sort of functioning prior, have totally deluded themselves there. But it's not just because of some corrupt bureaucratic system or something of that nature. We've totally liquefied our societies in this sort of physical presence and put it on these websites. And I don't think that really sufficiently just saying that there's just corruption abound really does enough to sufficiently answer our problems in this sort of hyper real time, and the sort of anxieties of the physical and anxieties of the mind from this sort of simulation and quite frankly paranoia and panic. This is part of how we're in the situation we're in to begin with. We can all act like at different times we were bamboozled by either this sort of, was joked about this sort of Calvinistic doomsday, but they're getting more and more intense, and we're beginning to be less and less sort of rational about sense in that sort of way that Descartes and Hobbes will be talking about when I go over them on the channel, because now we have this sort of digital ethic, we have this sort of digital presence that's not just side by side or just, you know, in the rear view mirror, but, you know, it's coming past us now. And, you know, what are we going to make of that? And like I said, this isn't necessarily just an endorsement. I think there is a sort of, you know, blackpilling way of looking at this video for sure. But ultimately, I do think that it is a sort of responsibility to be a sort of journalist, if you will, and actually, you know, telling the story of your people to the way you see fit. Which I think is actually something that could be learned a lot in this sort of digital experience. If we were to be more serious about this, then, you know, the kind of way of going about, you know, the digital experience and looking at it in this sort of, you know, different way, I think would actually, you know, give us potentially a better relationship, or at least a more coherent one, where it doesn't seem like we are so at its mercy.